Hey, you.
Where to get to work?
Sit by you. Rob?
Sure. Done all that.
It was scary yesterday.
He's going to be engineer.
About 25 minutes, right?
Yes.
You feel lonesome?
Alice has got, he's gonna show us a bit of the video.
Oh,
Affirmative action.
Are we all in?
Yeah.
Did it already.
yeah, we got some time. Okay.
Sweet families. Diversity efforts. Big salary. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Morning. Everyone has slept well or is sufficiently caffeinated now and remembers his or her dreams to tell me later. Had some good ones last night. I would also like to thank again the University of Malaya, our absolutely full 50-50 partner in this venture, and both Terrence and Michaeline for having inspired this conference and brought together such an agreeable and interesting group of people who are of an extraordinarily diverse array of opinions, which is wonderful. And we debate in a civil way about our diverse inferences regarding these phenomena, and to me, there's nothing that could be better at a conference, and I hope that spirit continues, that people will feel free to offer diverse opinions because we're all enriched by them. I would also like to remind you, please, to sign in, mentioning your institution of affiliation if you haven't signed into our sheets already. Because such documentation helps us to secure funding for ventures like this in the future from the university. I would also like to mention that we intend to make a film out of this conference, and I gather you are all enjoying your participation in it. If you have any shyness, let it go, because you can always ask for a retake. And we're also hoping to produce a special edition of a journal and an edited volume out of the proceedings. Fortunately, you're all 10 steps ahead by having submitted your papers beforehand. And we'd just like to ask you in every way possible to reflect on what your interlocutors have said, the challenges they've posed, and if you want to fortify your cases using their, explaining why they're wrong, or if you want to move your positions, it's all good. And we are hoping for you to submit your final submissions by March the 1st, 2013. And then we will seek publishers for them. And if you have any further questions on details, please write Terrence and Michaeline simultaneously, and we'll get you answers, advice, editorial feedback, or whatever you wish. Now, I'd like to observe a few of the themes that emerged in my dreams last night as I thought about the conversation of yesterday. I noticed a pattern of observations that democratic politics encourages the inclusion of more and more groups among the targets of affirmative action. And it also seems to encourage the dilution of justice-oriented goals for affirmative action. I also observed from your observations that affirmative action may be affected by the cronyism that is either endemic to dictatorships and democracies, or it might exacerbate that cronyism. I would ask us then, as we address these technical problems with the implementation of affirmative action, that we not lose sight of the justice-oriented goals that for the most part, affirmative action was implemented in order to address. We should not overlook whether those goals have been achieved amid those technical problems and how they can be made to succeed better. In other words, how justice-oriented goals can be served better by improved affirmative action policies, or if you wish, by the elimination thereof. But let us not forget about those justice-oriented goals. A further justice-oriented goal, well, those justice-oriented goals that I heard in our presentations were, one, the redress of past and present stigma and discrimination, and number two, the goal of national inclusion, or perhaps inclusion even in global citizenship. And again, we debated some of these issues and the best ways of achieving them in a very edifying way yesterday. One of the touchstones of that debate, or perhaps hot buttons, was the question of indigeneity. And I'd like to encourage some further thinking about that term. I myself am not satisfied with the notion that it's just an assertion that whose virtue lies only in the power to assert it. I'd like to suggest that there are certain historical conditions that are worth considering as we discuss the concept of indigeneity, and insofar as they apply, regard indigeneity as an important concept to address in affirmative action programs. Among these conditions are the fact that settler colonialisms usually move populations from larger and more economically central nations into areas where people lack such demographic and economic power. Another condition is the role of colonialists in creating the conditions of inequality. That is, often empires had multiple colonies and populations shifted among those colonies in a way that was mediated by the interests of colonialists. We must not overlook the role of military conquest, land expropriation, enslavement, genocide, and cultural genocide in projects of settler colonialism. Nor must we overlook the disproportionate patterns of disease that are found in the areas where such populations have been colonized by settlers, ranging from flu to alcoholism. We must also recognize the stigma of stupidity that regularly sticks to indigenous populations in settler colonies, and the work of Claude Steele on stereotype threat. How is people's performance on standard measures of performance affected by the stigma of stupidity? We must recognize communal and non-market oriented values in many such communities. Again, not universally among indigenous communities, but insofar as they apply, and we regard people who practice communal and non-market oriented values as an important part of the nation deserving of inclusion that is materially rewarding, we must consider indigeneity in itself as a category worth positive discrimination or inclusion. Another factor I'd like to have considered, again, without the intention of ranking suffering, is that settlers often have another country to go back to. Settlers often repatriate money to homelands. They sometimes maintain citizenship in those homelands. They sometimes bring their brides from those homelands, do not intermarry with the local population for reasons that are sometimes economically quite profitable for trade diasporas, for example. By contrast, the indigenous populations often have no place else to go. They're only home. Now, not all of these observations, again, apply equally to all cases of settlers and indigenous people interacting, but insofar as they do, I think we should keep indigeneity in mind as a category in our discussion of the justice-oriented goals of affirmative action, how to pursue those justice-oriented goals, and whether current measures have been adequate to achieve them. So with that, I would like to invite Michael Critchlow to introduce our keynote speaker of today and ask you to continue those debates, including debates with my own observations as the panelists resume. Thank you very much.
It gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker for the conference, William Sandy Darity, who's an Arts and Science Professor of Public Policy Studies and Economics. He's also the chair of African and African American Studies and director of the Research Network on Racial and Ethnic Inequality at Duke University. Sandy earned his PhD in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1978. And previously, he served as director of the Institute of African American Research, director of the Moore Undergraduate Research Apprenticeship Program, director of the Undergraduate Honors Program in Economics, and director of Graduate Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Darity's research focus on stratification economics, inequality by race, class, and ethnicity, schooling and the racial achievement gap, North-South theories of trade and development, skin shade and labor market outcomes, economics of reparations, the Atlantic slave trade, and the Industrial Revolution, doctrinal history, and the social psychological effects of unemployment exposure. Darity was in 2012, a recipient of the Samuel Westerfield, Z. Westerfield Award, the highest honor bestowed by the National Economic Association. He's also been a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford just last year. He's a fellow at the National Humanities Center in 1989 to 1990, and a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors in 1984. He's a past president of the National Economic Association and the Southern Economic Association. He's also taught at Grinnell College, the University of Maryland at College Park, the University of Texas at Austin, Simmons College and Claremont McKenna College, and was the editor-in-chief of the most recent edition of the International Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences from Macmillan in 2008. Darity has also published or edited 10 books and more than 220 articles in professional journals. And currently he lives with his family in Durham, Bull City, city of medicine. I like to say Bull City when people say, where are you? I say, I'm in Bull City. Where he occasionally plays harmonica in a local blues band. He occasionally coaches youth sport and enjoys reading science fiction and speculative fiction. Please welcome Professor William Darity.
Thanks. I'm kind of short, so thanks very much. I'd like to say thank you also to Michaeline for her instrumental role in organizing this remarkable conference, and to thank Randy Vittori, and also Kayla Brown and Bernice Patterson, who work with him at the Center for African and African American Research. I'm sorry, I got Terrence, I'm sorry, I apologize, thank you. Yes. That's the problem with trying to thank people in advance. You always miss somebody critical, and I apologize for that. So I'd like to talk about, or I'd like to frame my remarks in the context of thinking about the desegregation project and viewing affirmative action as an instrument for implementation of the desegregation project. The desegregation project, as I see it, is one that's focused on forms of redistribution that we could call nominal or indirect. There are some exceptions to this, particularly with the form that affirmative action has taken in a country like Malaysia, where, as a consequence, I believe, of a political majority implementing an affirmative action program on their own behalf, so a comparatively deprived population, but a political majority, the affirmative action program included, under the dictates of the new economic policy, a program of direct redistribution of wealth as one of its components. But this is an exception. And it's an exception in the context of affirmative action policies that typically operate as a set of positive anti-discrimination measures aimed at providing access to members of socially excluded groups, access to preferred positions in the society. And generally it's predicated on the existence of unfair or unjust exclusion of individuals based upon their social identity as members of a stigmatized group. So they would be excluded in the absence of affirmative action. So the companion premise is that discrimination against that group operates freely in the societies in question. So affirmative action targets groups subjected to discrimination, ridicule, deprivation, and abuse for special support in their pursuit of preferred positions. And I'm going to come back in a moment to the two major forms that affirmative action typically takes. But I also want to make an observation that's linked to a profound comment that Denise Ferreira da Silva made the other night when she opened the conference, where she suggested that to some degree, in countries where affirmative action is being rolled back, it's being rolled back because of the belief that it has accomplished its aims. In the context of the current Supreme Court decision, Fisher versus Texas, it appears that the court is paying key attention to the question of whether or not affirmative action has achieved, especially in the context of the University of Texas system, a critical mass effect. That is there a sufficient threshold number of students from the target population now attending those institutions so that the policy is no longer needed? Now, of course, this presumes that if there is indeed such a critical mass, that critical mass could be sustained in the absence of affirmative action, which of course then means that there is a companion assumption, which we will come to again, that discrimination no longer is operative in any significant way, or is not a barrier to the admission of students from the previously targeted group. And also, insofar as the concept of critical mass has a certain dent of arbitrariness around it in terms of what constitutes the proportion of the student body that would meet that standard, it's possible for one to argue that critical mass is something less than a proportional numerical representation of the community in question. Now, I'm wondering, though, whether the line of argument that affirmative action has accomplished its aims is the decisive one in the present moment, or the set of arguments that have been mounted continuously to claim that it is something that should never have been implemented in the first place. And we'll come back to this also. Keep in mind that in the US context, affirmative action has been in place for approximately 40 years. When I was doing a paper for the Chronicle of Higher Education about a decade ago on affirmative action, I discovered that there was a Jat in India, in Kerala, the Elava people, who are one of the depressed classes in India that have been recipients of the reservation system in India, and that there were a large number of younger people in the Elava community who were saying that they didn't need the reservation system anymore, that essentially their position was sufficiently satisfactory that they didn't need that type of support anymore. And so I did a little more investigation, and I recognized that Kerala, as one of the princely states, actually had affirmative action of the sort that we characterize as a reservation system for close to a century, because it was implemented in that state long before it was implemented at the federal level throughout India. So there is this interesting question as to how long you need to use the instrument of affirmative action. But apparently 40 years is not sufficient, as I'm going to argue in a moment. So affirmative action takes two forms that have been nicely characterized by Thomas Weisskopf as preferential boost and quota systems. Preferential boosts endow candidates competing for positions with additional points for being members of a target group, either explicitly or implicitly. Quotas set a fixed share of slots that only can be held by members of the target group. Now, while one approach or the other is usually dominant. For example, preferential boosts tend to have primacy in the United States and in South Africa, and indeed in the United States, there's legal barriers to actually using the language or the concept of quotas in any explicit way, while quotas tend to have primacy in India and Brazil. But I want to point out that these are not mutually exclusive. For example, a quota system may be predicated on eligibility thresholds anchored in a minimum qualifying score or standard, or preferential boosts may operate in such a way that de facto they give the target population a quota-like share of the available positions. So affirmative action measures are not intended to produce general equality, nor do they constitute an anti-poverty program. They are not reparations programs to compensate victim communities for a cumulative history of oppression. Affirmative action measures are intended to promote intergroup equality, and when deployed effectively, they are a useful instrument for, and this is the key phrase, desegregating elites. Okay. In short, the objective of affirmative action is roughly to replicate a similar pattern of occupational status, educational attainment, and income stratification across a socially subordinated population that prevails against a socially dominant population. It's also important to note that affirmative action is being adopted more widely internationally as a mechanism for improving the status of stigmatized communities. Policies of this type are in place in locations as diverse now, and the conference has paid close attention to some of these cases. It's Brazil, South Africa, Malaysia, Northern Ireland, the United States, India, and Colombia. And regardless of where programs are implemented, there's always the same set of complaints that are raised about them. It's almost as if somebody has rehearsed mechanically a common template of criticisms of affirmative action, and they just transfer them across countries. So I'm going to talk about, the 6 standard, I call them grumbles against affirmative action. I'm going to talk about them in some detail today. These grumbles are grumbles that say that affirmative action is wrong, not that it has completed its mission, but that it's absolutely wrong. That it was a bad thing to do in the first place. And the 6 of these are the following. First, affirmative action violates the principle of meritocracy. Okay, that's the first argument. The second is affirmative action lowers national productivity. The third argument is that students from the target population, when we're talking about affirmative action and higher education admission, are grossly underprepared for higher education when affirmative action is focused on access to colleges and universities. So here we're talking about selective colleges and universities in whichever country or community we're examining. And in that case, the argument is made that the students from the target population are distinctly inferior students on average than the students who were not admitted through affirmative action processes. Fourth, only the best positioned members of the target population really benefit from affirmative action. So in the rhetoric that's used in India, this is a reference to the notion that the beneficiaries of affirmative action are from the creamy layer. Okay, and I'll talk about that more. Fifth, the recipients of affirmative action are stigmatized by the preference or quota system. So there's this greater indicator of deficiency on the part of the target population simply because of the implementation of the affirmative action program. And then 6, if affirmative action programs are implemented, they should be implemented on the basis of class, not race or ethnicity. Okay, this is the Barack Obama position, in fact. Okay, so let's go to the first one. The first one is the claim that affirmative action violates the principles of meritocracy. And this is generally accompanied by the claim that it's unfair to members of the non-target group. And this is an issue that was discussed in depth in Denise Ferreira da Silva's presentation 2 nights ago. So they're alleged to have been subjected, the members of the non-target group are supposed to be the victims now, and the victimization is attributable to the fact that they've been subjected to reverse discrimination. So the existence of preferences or quotas on behalf of a target group violates norms of excellence in selection, in hiring, or university admissions. And at the heart of this argument are three related premises. First, that in the absence of affirmative action, purely meritocratic selection would prevail. Okay? Second, in the absence of affirmative action, very few members of the target community would meet the merit standards. And third, the prevailing merit standards themselves are fully appropriate to the tasks or activities for which persons are being selected. Okay. So, in the absence of affirmative action in the United States, rather than a regime of pure meritocracy, I would argue, the system of exclusion of blacks in particular preserved a privileged world for white, especially white male, mediocrity. Okay. So Lewis Gordon, I guess Lewis is not here anymore?
Where is he?
Okay, he's not here anymore. But he may have spoken about this. He may have spoken about this when he gave his presentation. But there's some recent reflections of his that I want to read verbatim, which I think are telling. And they speak to this question of the preservation of mediocrity in the absence of affirmative action. Okay, so Lewis said the following. When I was tenured at Brown University in 1997, the process required evaluations of my work from 5 referees. Expected performance was a published monograph, several articles, satisfactory teaching, service, and signs of international recognition. My dossier had the following: 3 monographs, one of which won a book award for outstanding work on human rights in North America, an edited book, a co-edited book, 40 articles, several of which had gone into reprint in international volumes, 2 teaching awards, and service that included heading a committee that recruited 23 scholars of color to the university. This process for my promotion and tenure was dragged out because of continued requests for more referees. The number grew to 17. Okay, this is Lewis Gordon's story. I have never heard of 17 external reports for a promotion, but okay. There was a comparable white candidate in the philosophy department. He also supposedly worked on existentialism, one of my areas of expertise. His dossier, a contract for his dissertation, and a few articles. His case was successful. His contracted dissertation was published several years later. He has since then not published the second book. He is now a full professor at the institution. Over the years, I have only met one person in his field who knew of and spoke well of his work. That person was a classmate of his in graduate school. Was affirmative action necessary for my promotion and tenure, Lewis says? Yes. But as should be evident from this example, and no doubt many others, there is another truth. Was investment in white supremacy necessary for less than stellar whites to be promoted? Yes. Affirmative action, which brought people of color to the table to learn firsthand about the level of performance of their white predecessors and contemporaries, stimulated a reflection on standards in many institutions. As more people of color began to meet inflated standards, what were being concealed were the low standards available to the whites who preceded them, and no doubt many who continue to join them as presumed agents of excellence. So what is the truth about the qualifications narrative? The claim about having to lower standards for the admission of people of color? It masks racial hegemonic mediocrity. Lewis says further, there is another truth. There are few systems that depend on excellence to function. Most of the services we rely on to get through our lives depend on average levels of performance, and that's pretty much it. The rewards lavished on many whites in the modern world have not been based on merit. What many people of color discovered upon entering those previously closed corridors was not white superiority, but for the most part, white mediocrity. So without affirmative action, those previously closed corridors are likely to go back to being closed. Not because there are no qualified blacks, but because there is an abundance of average whites who would have protected access. Indeed, long practiced affirmative action for whites has taken place in a variety of forms. The racialized distribution of the GI Bill benefits, legacies in college admissions, the racial limitations of the New Deal programs, racial preferences in the provision of home loans, and on and on. Now, because of this process of white protectionism, Major Coleman argues that there is strong evidence to indicate that if one compares blacks and whites holding the same positions, on average, the black employee probably will have superior qualifications. Furthermore, Ullman and Cohen's experimental research demonstrates that the merit standards themselves can alter as those who control them manipulate them to maintain preferred group status. They do not change simply because they are valid indicators of the skills or abilities needed to perform the task at hand. Ullman and Cohen's study involved a laboratory experiment with 73 undergraduates who were evaluating male or female candidates for a male-type job, the position of being police chief. Although the study participants actually rated the male and female candidates as equivalent on the two clusters of criteria specified for evaluation, that is, being streetwise, okay? So they had to be tough, they'd worked in rough neighborhoods, and they got along with fellow officers, and being formally educated, well-schooled and experienced in administration. But when the participants were asked to rate the relative importance of each of the specific characteristics within each cluster, they gave greater weight to whichever attribute favored the male candidate. Okay. Ullman and Cohen report the subtle way in which gender bias favoring men for the job emerged in their study as follows. Educated characteristics were rated as more important when the male applicant possessed them than when he did not. By contrast, no such favoritism toward the female applicant was evident. If anything, educated characteristics were viewed as less important when the female applicant possessed them than when she did not. Even stereotypically feminine traits, such as being family-oriented and having children, were defined as more important when the male possessed them than when he did not. There was no corresponding effect for female applicants. Okay. In short, the Ullman and Cohen study demonstrates that the standards themselves are, and this is the rhetoric we use in economics, are endogenous. Okay. They're partially changing in response to the demands for maintaining what Lewis Gordon has termed racial hegemonic mediocrity. For example, in one of the most blatant instances, as black students' performance on the ACT test rose from a low mean of 7 in 1963, it was 18 for white students at the time, the state of Mississippi consistently increased the minimum required for university admission to continue to limit blacks' eligibility for the state's public universities. But of course, as Nina Simone once said, Mississippi goddamn, right? Okay, second, does affirmative action reduce productivity? In a clever study performed in the mid-1990s, Cecilia Conrad, who is now, I believe she's like the provost at Pomona College, I believe, yeah. And she's soon to be the head of the committee that selects MacArthur Fellows. It's a pretty impressive study. Cecilia did a study, she's an economist, she did a study that demonstrated at the macro level that variations in the demography of the national workforce in the United States, both in terms of gender and racial composition, had no effect either on gross domestic product per capita nor output per head. In short, there's no evidence of a productivity gain or loss associated with the greater presence of female workers of any race or black workers of any gender in the United States. This, of course, might be a disappointing finding to those researchers who have claimed that discrimination produces a deadweight loss for the U.S. economy, which would then make it potentially beneficial for everyone if discrimination was eradicated. But still, while Conrad's findings suggest that affirmative action as an anti-discrimination measure has more of the character of a zero-sum game, which would also reinforce why there might be so much opposition to it, it provides no aid and comfort to those who insist that it is economically destructive. And keep in mind, the diversity defense for affirmative action, which lay at the heart of the previous Supreme Court decisions that concern the University of Michigan's admissions policy, the diversity defense was predicated on the belief that affirmative action must be something that benefits the privileged also for it to be justified. Whereas the justice or equity defense says we are remedying the inequalities that persist in this society due to discriminatory exclusion. And it's the justice defense that made no headway as a foundation for preserving affirmative action circa 2003. Now, Major Coleman also repudiates the productivity loss claim in a micro-level study. Coleman finds that employer performance evaluations of employees hired under affirmative action arrangements are at least as favorable as those for employees hired via what otherwise would have been the closed corridor. Holzer and Newmark arrive at a similar conclusion after reviewing all the available studies on work performance by affirmative action hires. The preponderance of evidence also indicates that if a black employee gets a position, frequently the employer who was negatively predisposed towards hiring blacks and who would not have hired them in the absence of an affirmative action initiative revises their prior belief more favorably toward the black employee after seeing them actually perform the job. Third, then is it the case that the charge that colleges and universities are taking sharply inferior black students on board under the dint of affirmative action programs valid? In the US context, it is transparent that there is a substantial gap in academic performance, particularly on standardized tests between black and non-black students, particularly white and Asian students. Now, it's my understanding that the best studies that have been performed in India and Brazil actually demonstrate that there is not a significant performance gap between students who were admitted under the affirmative action programs and students who were not. But in the United States, there is evidence of such a performance gap. Now, there is, of course, the companion question of whether tests like the SAT or the ACT are legitimate markers for predicting subsequent academic performance for college and university students as a group, as a whole. And in fact, the evidence is actually somewhat weak about the relationship between performance on the ACT and SAT and subsequent academic performance. But nevertheless, that issue aside, given a historical discrepancy which intermittently narrows, there can be little doubt that demanding higher and higher test scores for admission is a mechanism, a strategy explicitly employed in the state of Mississippi for maintaining black exclusion. An important component of the test score gap is a factor that is divorced from the skills possessed by the individual black or white student. To the extent that there are widely held beliefs about the cognitive inferiority of blacks, knowledge of the existence of these beliefs, regardless of whether black students share these negative beliefs about their group themselves, can have a depressing impact on black students' test performance. And I think at beginning this morning, Randy Mattori mentioned the Claude Steele stereotype threat hypothesis, and I want to talk about that in some greater detail than actually talk about what the magnitude of the effect of stereotype threat might actually be. So, the initial major study by Claude Steele and Jonathan Aronson involved measuring study participants' performance on 30 verbal items, 27 of which were difficult items taken from the GRE study guides. Only 30% of earlier samples had gotten these items correct, and 3 difficult anagram problems. Study participants were given 30 minutes to complete the test. Black students took the test by random assignment under 3 different conditions. In the threat condition, the participants were told they were taking a diagnostic test that measured intellectual ability, thus making the racial stereotype about intellectual ability relevant to their performance and establishing in them the threat of fulfilling it. In the non-threat condition, the participants were told that the same test was simply a laboratory problem-solving task that was a non-diagnostic test of ability, which presumably would make the racial stereotype about ability irrelevant to the black participants. And then the third group was given the same test under a second non-diagnostic condition, which exhorted participants to view the difficult test as a challenge. The critical finding was that after statistically adjusting for prior SAT scores, black students performed as well as white students under the 2 non-diagnostic or non-threat conditions, and substantially worse than whites under the diagnostic or threat condition. In fact, they performed slightly better under the non-threat challenging test condition than they did under the non-diagnostic problem-solving task condition. Steele, Spencer, and Aronson have argued that in the real world, high-stakes test situations automatically activate stereotype threat. In the low-stakes tests administered in laboratory settings, the threat had to be activated by administering cues to the test participants. But when black students are taking a standardized test like the SAT that affects their college admission, placement, and access to financial support, the threat is omnipresent. The potential effect of stereotype threat is not trivial. Steele and Aronson found in their first experimental study that blacks under the threat condition had scores 13% lower than comparable black students under a non-threat condition. A 13% reduction in an SAT score would mean a drop in a score from 1200 to 1044. In a second study, black participants under the stereotype threat condition completed about 6 fewer items than black participants not under the threat condition. In a further study, black students under the threat condition were slower by an average of 23 seconds in answering the first 5 questions, and answered 5 fewer questions correctly than black students not under the threat condition. Similar results were reported in other experiments by Steele. Black students alerted to the diagnostic nature of a difficult verbal test solved about 4 to 5 fewer items than those given no cue after adjustment for prior SAT scores. To the extent that Steele and his colleagues are correct, that stereotype threat generally comes into play in high-stakes testing situations, it would suggest that it is legitimate to set a lower score threshold for black students, as is sometimes done for Dalit students in India, precisely because the test score is likely to underestimate their academic potential. Indeed, Gregory Walton has a major study called Latent Ability, where he talks about the fact that this underestimation associated with standardized test scores, it has a profound effect on our inability to detect the degree of talent that individuals might possess. Indeed, the more selective the institution, implicitly the greater the role of affirmative action in promoting admission for students who would otherwise be excluded, the better the academic outcomes for both black and Hispanic students in the USA. At all intervals of the SAT distribution, the graduation rates of black students increase as institutional selectivity rises. Still, there are enduring racial ethnic gaps in graduation rates within selectivity tiers, but these could be explained fully by differences in socioeconomic status that correlate with race, ethnicity, and especially gaps in wealth. Fourth, the fourth standard charge against affirmative action is what I've called a moment ago, borrowing from the language that's used in India, the creamy layer effect, that the authentic beneficiaries from the target population are only persons who already are from the group's comparatively more affluent middle class. And this might be quite true. As noted above, affirmative action is not an anti-poverty program, nor is it a program intended to produce greater general or intra-group equality per se. Its raison d'etre is to make the class distribution within the subaltern population roughly similar to the class distribution in the dominant population. Insofar as this involves desegregation of elites, the subaltern middle class will be best positioned to take the positions that will alter elite demography. Affirmative action is well designed to produce and or enhance the creamy layer, so it is unsurprising that when it is effective, it may well have that consequence. Affirmative action is not a social initiative that is revolutionary in intent per se. Okay. Fifth is the charge that the recipients of affirmative action are stigmatized by the system of preferences or quotas. Now, at the heart of this grumble is the premise that affirmative action is intrinsically anti-meritocratic, rather than a means of ensuring that those with merit from the excluded community do have access to positions commensurate with their abilities and motivation. Again, Lewis Gordon's extended commentary that I quoted above takes the contrary stance. Affirmative action really promotes meritocratic principles by unsettling the turf that was previously set aside for mediocre whites. Moreover, affirmative action becomes a policy option precisely because there is a community subjected to stigmatization and discrimination in the first place. What exactly is the marginal increase in stigma from being the recipients of affirmative action benefits for an already stigmatized community? Some of the evidence that I mentioned above suggests that on net there is a positive benefit on employers' perceptions from black workers actually getting a foot in the door via affirmative action, suggesting that affirmative action may even be destigmatizing in a wide range of occupations. Okay? And then what's the final grumble? Final grumble is not necessarily an argument against affirmative action in toto. It is an argument that the target population is inappropriate, particularly if it is a racial or ethnic group. Here the grumblers propose that affirmative action should set as its target population the poor or economically deprived. In short, according to these grumblers, affirmative action should be class-based rather than race-based. Now, I want to argue that race-based and class-based affirmative action don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can have a policy that addresses both communities of need. Since affirmative action is an anti-discriminatory measure, its target populations should be identified on the grounds under which type of discrimination is actually taking place. If discrimination occurs on the basis of race, and if it occurs at the upper end of the occupational structure, solely class-based affirmative action will not be effective in reaching those sites of discrimination. In the United States in particular, class-based affirmative action cannot replicate what can be accomplished by race-based affirmative action. There's a study that I did with Ashwini Deshpande and Tom Weisskopf where we demonstrate that you will not generate the same composition, racial composition of your job hierarchy by using class-based affirmative action instead of race-based affirmative action. Again, its application on a racial basis is contingent on the recognition of the persistence of racial discrimination. Okay. Now, Lewis asked in his essay, what's the problem with affirmative action? And he offered two responses. First, when implemented, it works. Okay, that's what's wrong with it. Folks don't like it because it works when you actually use it. Second, its very existence forces the society that has adopted it to acknowledge that it continues to be a site where racism and discrimination operate. Not past discrimination, but current, ongoing, hard-hitting, present-day discrimination. And I think making such an admission may be the source of the biggest grumble of all.
Can you take questions, Sandy?
Sure. Yes.
I wonder whether you can address the question of the term affirmative action as a cultural symbol. You know, it began as a mathematical idea, but I was wondering over the years whether, like religious symbols, it has taken on other kinds of meanings. And those meanings have actually superseded the early construction. Whenever you use it, it tends to evoke a whole bunch of images. Some of them you have captured very nicely in the presentation. Is this something that ought to be incorporated on a paper like yours? I mean, the classification you gave of Weisskopf, here are two kinds. But I want to suggest to you, there is this other prowling kind of phantom-like thing behind there. Is this something we should add to the whole landscape you constructed there?
Yeah, I think you're talking about sort of the rhetorical evocations that are associated with the term affirmative action.
Value, religious superstition, the whole thing that enters into symbolism. You know?
Mystery, miracle, and authority.
Enters into the haunts of your subconscious and takes over rationality. So that what you've been discussing here is demythologizing the symbol.
Yeah.
Your paper is a demythologizing
So there's a very strong parallel to the issue that you're raising, which surrounds the discussion of another policy that's supposed to address the needs of historically deprived communities, which is the term reparations. And I find many people saying, can you talk about the idea but use a different term? Because people have such a reflexive negative reaction to the concept of reparations, which I think also occurs with affirmative action. Although affirmative action to me is a far more modest initiative than what I would conceive of as a reparations program. But I'm not sure what you replace it with. I mean, in many other countries there, besides the United States, there's a reference to these types of policies under different terminology, but I'm not sure that terminology doesn't evoke the same types of reactions now. So if you were to talk about, say, the quota system or reservations in India, I'm not sure that would evoke a much different kind of response, a more wise and temperate conversation than using the language of affirmative action. So I think it's really a question of what's become the customary terminology in the social community where the policy is being attempted.
Well, an economist approaches this question of affirmative action in a particular way. A political scientist does, a sociologist does. But I'm suggesting that this thing has entered into another realm where a psychoanalyst is probably best engaged. But I want to go one step further and suggest to you the way in which you need to deal with this is the problem of the haunted house. The need for an exorcist. The monster is not in the haunted house, it's in the haunted head. And so I regard your presentation as that of an exorcist.
I haven't heard much discussion at this point, but Jim Webb from Virginia brought it up in an NPR meeting, a conversation, about the relationship between indigenous American populations and immigrant populations in the area of affirmative action.
Yeah.
In the practical sense, what it has meant is that blackness, the color black,
Yes.
has been the basis upon which affirmative action programs have been operating. And I wonder how we take into account that particular reality, and it's a growing reality.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think you're raising the issue that is apparent at many selective institutions in the United States, including this one, including Duke, where a significant proportion of the black student body are students who are from families that are of relatively recent immigration to the United States. Possibly first generation, but second generation at most. And that the historic introduction of affirmative action presumably was intended to address the discriminatory history that had been lodged against what, for want of a better term, I might call native black Americans. Like I don't have a good term for that. But
they call themselves regular blacks.
Yes, well, I say non-exotic blacks. I'm not exotic.
Or just blacks.
Just blacks. But if the presumption is that affirmative action is an instrument intended to address discrimination, and discrimination operates against blacks regardless of their point of origin in the United States or the timing of their origin in the United States, then I think that there's not any significant reason to make a distinction. However, and here's the big however, if you were thinking in terms of numerical representation, you could argue that the immigrant black population is overrepresented in selective institutions, while the native black population is underrepresented. And that may be the core reason for having some concern, particularly in the context of a conversation of what is the appropriate critical mass. So this is a really hard issue, and I'm not sure how you answer it. In Duke's context, when Duke desegregated, and remember I opened my remarks by talking about this as a desegregation project. When Duke desegregated, the black students who came to Duke were students who were drawn from what was then still functioning as a dual educational system throughout the South, from predominantly black high schools throughout the southern United States. I had a number of friends who were from Atlanta who had come to Duke at that point. And there was a shift in the admissions office's emphasis for recruitment of students, sites of recruitment, which has resulted in the change in the composition of the student body in terms of the nativity of the black population that's here at Duke. And so that's what we need to examine is, what were the motivations for changing where you were drawing your students from, why, and why are these disproportionate compositional effects with respect to this population.
So the shift was toward recruiting from northern schools?
Yes, from northern schools, and ultimately towards more northern suburban rather than urban schools. Yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe the answer is already the part of the presentation that says diversity is now the objective.
Yeah.
But my question is
excellent
this
point.
though, why has affirmative action been so silent on the gender aspect? Some say that white women have benefited far more from affirmative action. So, but in time, someone is talking about affirmative action in the United States, they're talking about race, and the gender part is so quiet.
So if I go back to Denise's observation on Friday night, the silence may be attributable to the fact that affirmative action really is no longer needed, particularly for white women. So, because, I mean, if you think about it, at our most selective institutions now, the majority of students are female. Okay, and on the basis of conventional standards of admission, if anything, I think the argument is you would have more female students if you stuck with the traditional conditions of admission. So there's no need for affirmative action to address that dimension of the gender issue. Now, in terms of faculty composition, higher ranks of the faculty, yes. But in terms of student admission or undergraduate admissions, I don't think it's really there's any need to utilize affirmative action because you don't have to. If anything, what schools are doing are they're imposing a quota, an implicit quota that's reducing the number of female students, if anything. So, I mean, this is what was done with respect to Jewish students at the selective institutions in the 1920s. Their numbers had grown substantially. Some people were upset about this, and so they imposed quotas to reduce their presence in those institutions.
But we shouldn't underestimate the gender gaps in other professions.
No,
and in terms of income.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely
big
not.
gendered gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. But for some reason in the U.S., again, affirmative action has been heavily freighted by paying attention to undergraduate admissions to colleges and universities. Yeah. There and then in the back. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, please.
Thank you. I'm really pleased, to engage with you today. I want to link a response to the person's question in the back about the color black to a question. And for me, when one focuses on color, we're thinking with our eyes, and we're actually working with a biological conception of race. Whereas when we're thinking with our brains, we are working with the historical experience of being black or of being excluded, of being discriminated against. So that is a political, when we're thinking with our brains, we're thinking with a political conception of blackness rather than a biological, visual conception of blackness. And that is what I'd like to connect to my question, because part of my project in South Africa, sorry, my name is Zimitri, and I'm from South Africa. And part of my project in South Africa is for us to, and some of your work has influenced this argument of mine, is that we don't need the race classification categories of apartheid, which rely on thinking with our eyes in order to address the racial inequalities that emerge from the historical and political experiences of being black. And there are a range of black experiences. There is not just one. And so, my question to you is, when you argue in some of your work that asset-based wealth is the core of racial inequalities, okay, and that one does not in fact need those visual classifications.
Yes.
You can use other indicators in order to access racial inequalities specifically. Now that for me is a very powerful argument. And the question I have to you is, how then, given that one cannot measure psychosocial factors, okay, the way in which we can measure asset-based wealth, how can we combine instruments that measure asset-based wealth historically and in the present with some kind of sense of a the psychosocial conditions with how they might change? How can one combine those two instruments in order to address both aspects of discrimination? That's the one thing. And the second thing is, and this is the final thing.
That's the one.
Yeah. The final thing is, when asking people about their asset-based wealth, they are generally more willing to talk about their education and so on and so on. But when it comes to inheritance and, the loans that they have or how many properties they own, one cannot really rely on that data. So what would you do?
So with respect to the second question, which is maybe the easier one, although hard, it's less of a problem in the context of a society where there are legal requirements that you must make reports on your assets to pay your taxes. And if you do not make such reports, then presumably you may be subjected to certain types of penalties, okay? So there's an imperfection there. But I think it's not an imperfection that's so severe that we wouldn't be able to recognize that Mitt Romney or Bill Gates have extraordinarily high wealth positions, and that folks at the other end of the wealth distribution may actually have negative net worth. So I've argued that we could design universal programs to address some of these distributional concerns, where, for example, we might provide each newborn infant with a trust fund that's funded by the federal government, and that the variation in the amount of the trust fund would be contingent on the net worth position of their families, which you would have to extract from information about the family's tax reports. Okay. And that's about the best you could do. And so I said it's a universal program, but it would be graduated. So you would give, if Bill and Melinda Gates had a new child, you'd give that kid a $50 trust fund. But for children whose families are at the other end of the wealth distribution, you would give that child a $50,000 to $60,000 endowment. And so, I mean, this is a direct way of addressing wealth. You are not asking the color question per se, but you are having an implicit positive effect on the well-being of a number of colored families because their wealth positions are so low on average. Okay, so yes, I mean, so you would have to make use of tax information to try to do this. Now, in societies where there is a very low degree of credibility associated with tax filings, then it becomes much more problematic to do this effectively. But with respect to the question of the psychosocial effects and how you address that, I don't know. I mean, we're getting closer to the territory that you were talking about. I don't know. I don't know if you could put an entire population on the couch. I mean, I'm just not really sure. But we certainly could, if we wanted to, alter the wealth distribution of the society in a very significant way. Yeah.
Yeah, just two questions you might want to comment on. The first has to do with the linking up with the earlier question in relation to within the subaltern.
Kindly speak a little
Sorry,
louder.
let me
for
out.
us.
Within the subaltern group,
Yes.
there would be subgroups, some of which are probably less privileged than others.
Yes.
So the question is, how do you prioritize? There probably, in the case of the United States, for instance, there'll be like Latinos, well, minorities
Yes.
who have been, I
So-called
believe,
minorities.
yeah, been incorporated into the, if you like, target group for affirmative action. So, so what do you think should happen in terms of some of the groups probably might be more underprivileged than others?
So affirmative action.
And,
Affirmative
so
action
within-
it does not intrinsically, and the types of affirmative action that I'm talking about, preferential boost or quota systems, do not address the problem that.
Yeah, that's the whole thrust of my question. Whether affirmative action should not only address the inequality between the large subaltern group and the dominant group, but also within this subaltern group itself, where there are differences between the minorities.
Yeah, I'm saying I don't think that that's a task that we can ascribe or assign to affirmative action policies. We have to have some other types of policies to address those kinds of inequalities. I don't think that falls under the rubric. That's not what affirmative action is designed to do, and it doesn't do that. So affirmative action is not enough. Okay, so in a society that may be affirmative action exhausted, saying affirmative action is not enough and that there are other things we also need to do may be problematic, but that's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, okay.
So do you?
We'll carry it. Let's go.
Yeah, so this is a question coming from a political scientist that I want you to speculate a little bit about. Something that I see happening is the changing in the rules of the game as the context change. In the sense that the Supreme Court, you mentioned Fisher, the Fisher case.
Yeah.
Supreme Court is also contemplating or looking at the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah.
To see when is enough.
Enough, right.
So the question I have, and you alluded to this in your comments, so as the dynamics change and the demographics change, if you look at college campuses, I think about California, and the Asian population on college campuses beginning to generate conversations on how do you limit.
Right.
We have whites now advocating for affirmative action.
So you're going to create exclusive quotas to keep down the numbers of Asian students, or exclusive quotas to make sure you don't have 70% of your student body be female.
Right.
And
it's coming from divorces that not so long ago had been the opponents of this very kind of activity.
Yeah.
Now, do you see that happening more and more? What are the implications right now with whites starting to say, well, we need affirmative action to maintain
well, I mean, yeah, you actually hear affirmative action initiatives being proposed, especially for white males.
Right.
Yeah, well, okay, my question is this. Are they subjected to discrimination? Because if they're not, then there's no case for affirmative action on their behalf.
Right.
I mean, yeah.
Okay, just to respond. Okay, well, part of my question I think was Stephen asked it, but still we are talking about, so I agree with you. So if affirmative action is all about desegregation,
Yeah.
and if it presupposes a society like the US, which had a black elite, which was segregated,
Right.
then that's how it should do. But when we bring the conversation to the global context, then we have all those different social, historical situations in which, again, there are not only there are inequalities within the subaltern group, but also such, for instance, Brazil. Brazil is always an excellent example to make things weird, funny, and complicated. So, following the logic of desegregation, then the quota system in Brazil would do exactly what the Brazilian national ideology always said it was true about Brazil.
Achieve
The problem
racial
we don't
democracy?
have, we don't have blacks because they're poor, right? So if we give them, access to education, they will no longer be poor and they'll be here. So there's no racial discrimination in Brazil as long as we create a quota system that will bring more blacks. And even worse, because then once they make it, they become white. Because that's on the other side of the racial ideology. So that's, that's the joke, but it's always revealing of the need, the need for something else. And then how do we think together about that something else once we recognize that affirmative action is, after all, so American? So can we think with us?
Well, okay, so, I think your question prompted me to talk about some of the something else's that I personally have in mind. So one is this child trust fund proposal, which was adopted on a fairly small scale for about 6 or 7 years in the UK.
Sweden.
Yeah.
Also Sweden.
Sweden also, okay. And I'm thinking of something far more substantial than the kinds of proposals that have come.
And that's gonna fly with the Republicans.
Well, hey, if you don't put the ideas out there, they won't get out there at all. But the other proposal that I've been advocating, which is again a universal proposal, and I thought it might catch some attention in the current economic crisis in this country, is a federal job guarantee for all citizens. And the closest example to something comparable, although it has a set of problems, is the rural employment guarantee that's been established in India. So then one of the countries with a relatively low per capita income has actually implemented this policy that none of the OECD countries have attempted to do, which is to say that we remove the threat of unemployment, we assure every citizen the right to have a job, and the job will be provided by the federal government. And you could get rid of minimum wage laws because this would set a floor on the standard for employment. Because why would anybody take a private sector job unless it paid them at least as much as they could get from the public sector? So I have ideas, but these ideas are ideas that are politically will require major social movements for them to actually take place. Yeah.
I wonder if you would address the following complication in the model of affirmative action as a way of diversifying the elite.
Okay.
I realize the contemporary discussion is centered on undergraduate admissions. There have been times it was centered on med school admissions. But there was also this period in the like the Baki case.
Yeah.
There was also this series of cases in the 1970s that made it into lower courts and was a source of enormous anger in the white working class. And that is affirmative action to diversify firefighters, corps,
construction industry,
yep. Police forces,
yes.
and so forth. So
yes.
Those aren't exactly elite, but somehow they just dropped off the radar.
Yes.
So where do those cases fit in your model, and how you would want to characterize
So the other
action?
language I used besides elite was preferred positions.
Okay.
Okay, and so they are not what we think of as elite positions, but they are well paid, relatively speaking. They usually have a pretty substantial benefits package associated with them, particularly if they're public sector or civil service jobs like the police or the firefighters. And
High socialist view.
right, and they're jobs that provide a decent income without necessarily requiring a high level of educational attainment. So these are preferred positions, and these are the ones that, you know, I think people will fight to keep closed. Yeah.
And I just
Yeah.
want to make sure they
excellent.
don't get excluded
Excellent
from the
example.
conversation, because there's somewhere in between that class-based affirmative action thing and the
No, that's exactly
and the
right.
race-based, because in the United States, working-class whites have historically worked extremely hard to keep black people even out of the lowest skill jobs and to give their own preferences.
Yeah. So there's some other work that I've done with Algernon Austin and with Derek Hamilton, where we looked at the phenomenon of occupational crowding, and we looked at the distribution of employment by race and gender based upon accounting for what seemed to be the average educational attainment of people holding those jobs. And so we find that particularly in jobs that don't require high levels of credentials but are relatively well paid, that's where you see a substantial absence of black workers. And so that's very consistent with the set of jobs that you're describing. Yeah.
Yeah, just want to take you back to your last comment, quoted from Louis. Maybe Louis can help you answer that. The affirmative action well, the problem is that affirmative action has worked. And secondly, it's a new site for ethnic contestation. So in other words, if you have achieved a certain degree of parity, in other words, you have you have kind of moved away from the hegemonic, subaltern, dominant kind of relationship. So would it mean a new phase of mutual relationship or a new phase of contestation? Since the previously dominant white losing their privileged position, will try to reconstruct a new form of hierarchy to sustain the old order. And thus you have a new, so affirmative action comes to an end, and then what next? A new process.
So,
what is the future?
but I mean, your question is predicated on the view that affirmative action had done its work.
Yeah, and then based on your comment, that
Well, but when I said I was agreeing with Lewis's observation that one of the reasons there is so much opposition to it is it works, I was also qualifying that by saying it works when it is implemented vigorously. Okay, so I don't think it has consistently been implemented vigorously in the United States. And in fact, the transition from a quota focus to a preferential boost focus is an example of the effort in the United States to dilute affirmative action's operation. So I just want to say, your question seems to be predicated on the view, let's imagine that it has done its work.
It has worked.
What are the consequences?
What next in terms of ethnic relations? In terms of how the dominant whites, for instance.
So if it had done its work and we truly had desegregated the hierarchical structure of the United States, then it would mean that we still have a hierarchical structure, but there's not much of a correlation between race and what your position is within that hierarchical structure. So we might make the argument then that we really do have a basis for a genuine critique and challenge to the hierarchical structure itself that we might not have had otherwise because of the race division. Or we could argue, well, you've effectively bought off this segment of the population that might be most resistant to the way in which the hierarchical structure operates. So, yeah, I don't know, is my answer.
Terrence, I'm so sorry, but we have to move on to the
But we
next
can talk
panel.
outside.
But I hope the rest of us can overhear your dialogue afterwards. It will be very interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Okay, so for our next panel, please.
Oh, yes, Touchville and Touchville. Yes, no. Right. But this is the creation of artificial groups. Right, exactly. And people's eyes to these artificial created I don't know.